Have you ever noticed how the person who stays calm in an argument always seems to have the upper hand? Winning any argument without saying much isn't about having the best words. It's about knowing when to stay silent. The other person rants, repeats themselves, desperately tries to prove a point, while the one who speaks the least holds all the power. But what if I told you that the moment you stop over-explaining is the moment you take control? It's like a wildfire feeding on oxygen. The more air you give it, the bigger it grows. But remove the oxygen, the fire dies on its own. Or think of a chess master. He doesn't rush his moves, doesn't react emotionally. He lets his opponent overextend, make mistakes, and then strikes with precision. That's the power of strategic silence. Because while they're busy arguing, losing themselves in emotion, you have a choice. Engage in their chaos or rise above it. And when you master control, that's when the balance shifts. The moment you stop reacting, the moment you hold your ground, they start to doubt themselves. Suddenly, their words feel empty, their confidence wavers, and you've already won without raising your voice, without proving anything. So, how do you do it? How do you make them lose control without saying much at all? Stay until the end, because the last one will change everything. Let's get started. Number 1. Stay calm while they lose control. Let's talk about one of the most underrated yet powerful ways to win an argument. Staying calm while the other person loses control. Most people think winning an argument is about having the best points, the most facts, or the loudest voice. But the truth, it's not about what you say, it's about how you handle yourself. When emotions take over, logic fades, and the moment someone starts arguing with feelings rather than reason, they've already weakened their own position. That's where your advantage comes in. Your ability to stay calm makes them look irrational. Here's the reality. People who argue emotionally expose their own weakness. The louder they get, the more desperate they appear. The more frustrated they become, the less credible they seem. And while they're busy reacting, you're in control, observing, analyzing, and waiting for the right moment to respond. When you stay calm, you shift the power dynamic. You force them to deal with their own emotions, while you remain unshaken. And this is where Stoic wisdom comes in. Marcus Aurelius said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That's the key. You can't control how someone else reacts. You can't stop them from raising their voice, twisting your words, or trying to provoke you. But what you can control is your own response. You can choose to stay composed while they unravel. You can choose to remain unbothered while they let their emotions dictate their behavior. And when you do, you win. Not just the argument, but the respect of everyone watching. Let me share a story. A guy I know, let's call him James, once found himself in a heated workplace debate. His colleague was furious, throwing accusations, interrupting, and trying to get a reaction. But James, he just listened. He didn't roll his eyes, he didn't smirk, he didn't rush to defend himself. He let the other person talk until they ran out of steam. And when James finally spoke, his words were calm, measured, and logical. The result? Everyone in the room sided with him, not because he had better arguments, even though he did, but because he remained composed while the other person looked unhinged. So how do you master this? First, pause before reacting. The moment you feel anger or frustration rising, take a breath. Don't let them pull you into their emotional storm. Second, lower your tone. When someone yells, responding softly makes them look even more out of control. And finally, watch their energy fade. The more they lose control, the more foolish they appear. All you have to do is stand your ground. At the end of the day, the person who stays calm always holds the real power. Arguments aren't won by the loudest voice, but by the steadiest mind. So let them get emotional. Let them expose their weakness. While they lose control, you remain untouchable. Number 2. Ask sharp questions instead of defending yourself. Let's talk about one of the most effective ways to win an argument without even arguing: asking sharp questions instead of defending yourself. Most people, when attacked in a debate, immediately go into defense mode. They explain, justify, and try to prove their point. But here's the problem. The moment you start defending, you've already lost control of the conversation. You're reacting to their attacks instead of making them question their own stance. Here's the truth. Rather than arguing, ask pointed questions that expose flaws in their reasoning. Let them defeat themselves. When someone makes a weak argument, don't fight it head-on. Instead, turn it back on them with a question that forces them to think deeper. The more they struggle to explain themselves, the more their argument crumbles. And the best part, you don't even have to say much. Just let their own words work against them. And this is where Stoic wisdom comes in. Marcus Aurelius said, "The nearer a man comes to a calm mind, the closer he is to strength." A calm, strategic mind will always outmatch an emotional, defensive one. Instead of getting trapped in a back and forth, step back and put the burden of proof on them. If their argument is weak, it won't hold up under pressure. If it's flawed, it will collapse under its own weight. Your job isn't to fight. It's to guide them into exposing their own contradictions. Let me share a story. A guy I know, let's call him Daniel, was in a debate with a co-worker who claimed that Daniel's project idea was unrealistic. Instead of getting defensive, Daniel simply asked, "What specifically makes you think it won't work?" His co-worker hesitated, but then mentioned a minor issue. Daniel followed up with, "And how would that be different from how we handled similar challenges in the past?" The co-worker fumbled, realizing he didn't actually have a strong argument. He was just opposing for the sake of it. Within minutes, he was backtracking, and Daniel had won the argument without ever raising his voice. So, how do you apply this in real life? First, stay calm and composed. The more relaxed you are, the more control you have. Second, ask precise, pointed questions. Make them explain their position fully. It's often weaker than they think. And finally, resist the urge to defend. Instead of explaining yourself, make them explain themselves. At the end of the day, the person asking the questions controls the conversation. Arguments aren't won by shouting the loudest. They're won by making the other person realize their own mistakes. So let them talk, let them struggle, and let their own words work against them. Number 3, use silence to make them doubt themselves. Let's talk about one of the most underrated yet powerful tactics in an argument: silence. Most people think that winning a debate means talking more, proving more, and responding to every point. But the truth? Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. When used correctly, silence isn't weakness. It's a psychological weapon that forces the other person to rethink their position. Here's the reality. Silence creates discomfort. When someone is arguing, they expect resistance. They expect you to react, to fight back, to meet their energy with equal force. But when you don't, when you just sit back, stay calm, and say nothing, it leaves them with nothing to push against. And that's when doubt starts creeping into their mind. They start questioning themselves. Did I say something wrong? Do they know something I don't? Did I just weaken my own argument? That uncertainty, that's where you win. And this is where Stoic wisdom comes in. Epictetus once said, "Let silence be your goal, except when speaking is more valuable." That's the key. Not every argument needs a response. Not every attack needs to be met with words. Sometimes the most powerful move you can make is to let your silence do the talking. Because when you say nothing, you're not just avoiding conflict, you're forcing the other person to confront their own thoughts, their own contradictions, and their own insecurities. Let me share a story. A man I know, let's call him Alex, was in a heated debate with a colleague who was desperately trying to prove him wrong. The colleague kept throwing out arguments, talking over him, and trying to get a reaction. But Alex? He just listened. No interruptions, no counter-arguments, no emotional reactions. Just silence. And then, something interesting happened. The colleague started repeating himself. He started filling in the gaps, trying to justify his own words, as if he needed Alex's validation. And the more he talked, the more obvious it became that he wasn't as sure of himself as he pretended to be. By the time Alex finally spoke, his colleague had already weakened his own argument. So how do you use this strategy effectively? First, resist the urge to respond immediately. When someone challenges you, pause. Let the silence hang in the air. Second, use eye contact. A steady, calm look can make them feel even more uncertain. And finally, watch them break under their own words. The more silence you allow, the more they'll try to fill it, often revealing their own weaknesses in the process. At the end of the day, silence is power. It makes them uncomfortable. It forces them to doubt themselves. And most importantly, it puts you in control without you ever having to say a word. If you found this valuable, hit like and subscribe for more powerful insights. Number 4. Agree with the truth, then redirect. Let's talk about a technique that completely disarms your opponent, agreeing with the truth, then redirecting the conversation. Most people think that winning an argument means fighting back against everything the other person says. But here's the problem. When you resist every single point, you look defensive, not rational. The smarter approach? Acknowledge what's reasonable, then subtly steer the conversation in your favor. Here's the truth. When you agree with parts of their argument, it catches them off guard. They expect resistance. They expect you to push back. But when you say, "You know what? That's a fair point," or "I see where you're coming from," it changes the entire energy of the debate. Instead of fighting, you're now in control. Because once you acknowledge what's reasonable, you can then redirect the conversation toward your perspective. And because you didn't reject everything outright, they're much more likely to listen. And this is where Stoic wisdom comes in. Marcus Aurelius said, "Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself." What does that mean? It means that you don't need to prove yourself right at all costs. You don't need to fight just for the sake of fighting. Instead, be flexible in discussion, open to reason, but strict with your own discipline and logic. A truly strong person doesn't fear agreement. They use it as a tool to guide the conversation. Let me share a story. A woman I know, let's call her Sarah, was debating with a co-worker about a project strategy. The co-worker was pushing an idea that Sarah didn't fully agree with, but instead of immediately rejecting it, she said, "You bring up a great point about efficiency, and I totally agree that we need to streamline the process." That one sentence made the co-worker feel heard, but then Sarah smoothly redirected. At the same time, I think if we take that approach, we might lose some quality. What if we combine both ideas to get the best of both worlds? Instead of arguing, she turned the discussion into a collaboration, and by the end, the co-worker was agreeing with her. So how do you use this strategy effectively? First, find common ground. Even in the worst arguments, there's something reasonable in what the other person is saying. Second, acknowledge it out loud. When you validate their perspective, they lower their defenses. And finally, redirect the conversation. Steer it toward your perspective while keeping them engaged rather than pushing them away. At the end of the day, agreeing with the truth doesn't mean surrendering. It means strategically leading the discussion. When you use this technique, people stop seeing you as an opponent and start seeing you as someone worth listening to. And that's how you win the argument, without making it feel like a battle. Number 5, let them talk themselves into a corner. Let's talk about one of the smartest ways to win an argument: letting the other person defeat themselves. Most people feel the need to jump in, correct mistakes, and constantly counter every point. But here's the truth. The more they talk, the more contradictions they reveal. If you let them keep speaking, they will overextend, exaggerate, and expose their own errors without you lifting a finger. Here's the reality. People who argue emotionally or without solid reasoning often trap themselves. When someone is too eager to prove their point, they start throwing out claims without fully thinking them through. And the more they talk, the harder it becomes for them to stay consistent. Eventually, they contradict themselves, expose their own weak logic, or make statements that don't add up. That's when you step in, not to attack, but to gently highlight the inconsistencies they created for themselves. And this is where Stoic wisdom comes in. Zeno of Citium said, "Better to trip with the feet than with the tongue." In other words, a person who speaks carelessly will eventually stumble over their own words. When you give someone enough space to talk, their own tongue becomes their downfall. Your role? Stay quiet, listen carefully, and let them walk right into their own mistakes. Let me share a story. A man I know, let's call him Eric, was in a debate with a friend who was convinced that Eric's new business idea wouldn't work. Instead of defending himself, Eric just kept asking questions. "Why do you think that? Can you explain that a bit more? How would that apply in a real-world situation?" His friend kept talking, explaining and over-explaining. And then it happened. He contradicted himself. First, he said the market was too small. Then, a few minutes later, he argued that competition was too high. Eric just smiled and calmly pointed it out. So is the market too small, or is there too much competition? Because it can't be both. In that moment, his friend realized his argument didn't hold up. Eric had won, not by arguing, but by letting his friend talk himself into a corner. So how do you use this strategy? First, resist the urge to interrupt. The more they speak, the more they reveal. Second, listen carefully. Instead of thinking about your next point, focus entirely on spotting inconsistencies. And finally, use simple questions to expose contradictions. You don't need to attack, just guide them into realizing their own mistake. At the end of the day, sometimes the best way to win an argument is to say less, not more. Let them talk, let them overextend. And when they inevitably trip over their own words, all you have to do is calmly point it out. If you've watched the video this far, don't forget to leave a comment with a "thank God" and give it a like if you enjoyed the content. Your support means a lot and motivates me to keep creating more interesting videos. I hope you find inspiration in them and that we continue learning together. Thank you for your support. Number 6. Don't take their bait. Stay detached. Let's talk about one of the most effective ways to win an argument: refusing to take the bait. Emotional arguments are traps. They're designed to pull you in, get a reaction out of you, and make you lose control. But here's the secret. If you refuse to react, you frustrate their attempts to manipulate you. When you remain detached, you strip them of their power. Here's the truth. People who argue emotionally aren't looking for logic. They're looking for a reaction. They want to provoke you, to make you angry, to get you to fight on their terms. The moment you take the bait, you lose control of the situation. But if you stay calm, composed, and emotionally detached, you turn the trap back on them. They get more and more frustrated while you remain unshaken, making them look irrational while you look in complete control. And this is where Stoic wisdom comes in. Marcus Aurelius said, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." That's the key. You don't win by lowering yourself to their level. You don't have to match their energy, meet their anger with anger, or engage in pointless emotional battles. Instead, you win by staying above it, by remaining unmoved, by letting them waste their energy while you keep yours. Let me share a story. A guy I know, let's call him Kevin, was dealing with a co-worker who always tried to get under his skin. Whenever there was a disagreement, this co-worker would raise his voice, throw sarcastic comments, and try to make Kevin look bad in front of others. But Kevin never reacted. He never raised his voice, never got emotional, never played into the trap. Instead, he stayed calm, answered with logic, and even smiled when the co-worker tried to provoke him. And you know what happened? The co-worker got angrier. He became so frustrated that he ended up exposing his own lack of control. Kevin didn't have to do anything. He won by refusing to engage in the emotional chaos. So how do you master this? First, recognize the bait. When someone is pushing your buttons, pause and remind yourself, it's a trap. Second, stay calm and detached. Respond with logic, not emotion. If they're yelling, lower your voice. If they're provoking you, stay neutral. And finally, let them exhaust themselves. The more they try to manipulate you and fail, the weaker they look. At the end of the day, people who argue with emotion are trying to pull you into their storm. But you don't have to go with them. Stay detached, stay calm, and let them drown in their own frustration. That's how you win, without even lifting a finger. Number 7. State your point. Briefly, then stop talking. Let's talk about one of the most powerful tactics in an argument: saying less. Most people think that to win a debate, they need to keep explaining, keep proving their point, and keep adding more and more words. But here's the truth. The stronger your argument, the fewer words you need. A well-placed, confident statement is like a sharp blade, precise, effective, and impossible to ignore. Here's the reality. When you speak too much, you give them more opportunities to twist your words, poke holes in your logic, or derail the conversation. But when you state your point clearly and stop talking, you force them to struggle for a counter-argument. You make them do the heavy lifting. You leave them with nothing to grab onto, no unnecessary details to pick apart, just a solid, unshakable point that stands on its own. And this is where Stoic wisdom comes in. Epictetus said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." In other words, you don't need to over-explain, over-justify, or beg for validation. When your argument is strong, let it speak for itself. Confident people don't feel the need to convince. They state the truth, and that's enough. Let me share a story. A man I know, let's call him Jason, was in a debate about workplace efficiency with his boss. His boss kept making excuses for why a new system wouldn't work. Instead of arguing endlessly, Jason simply said, "We can run a 1-week trial. If it works, we keep it. If it doesn't, we go back. No risk." Then he stopped talking. His boss sat there, thinking. There was no room to argue. Jason had given him nothing to fight against. The silence made the boss uncomfortable, and eventually he just said, "Fine, let's try it." Jason won, not by talking more, but by saying just enough. So, how do you use this in real life? First, make your point clear and direct. No extra fluff, no unnecessary words. Second, stop talking. Let your words settle. Let the silence make them think. And finally, hold your ground. When you don't feel the need to explain, you project confidence. And confidence is hard to argue against. At the end of the day, the person who talks less often has more power. While they scramble to find a counter-argument, you sit back, knowing your point was enough. Speak with confidence, then let them struggle with the silence. That's how you win. Number 8. Know when to walk away. Let's talk about one of the smartest ways to win an argument: knowing when to walk away. Not every battle is worth fighting. Some people don't argue to find the truth. They argue to feel superior, to waste your time, or to drag you down into pointless debates. And when you engage with them, you're not winning. You're just giving them exactly what they want. Here's the truth. Sometimes, the best way to win is to leave them arguing with themselves. If someone is unwilling to listen, if they refuse to consider another perspective, if they're just arguing to feed their ego, why waste your energy? The more you try to reason with them, the deeper you get pulled into their chaos. But when you walk away, you deny them the reaction they crave. And nothing frustrates a manipulative person more than being ignored. And this is where Stoic wisdom comes in. Epictetus said, "It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows." If someone is convinced they already have all the answers, then no amount of logic, proof, or reasoning will change their mind. So why waste your breath? A wise person knows that not every argument is worth their time. They don't chase battles that lead nowhere. Instead, they choose peace over pointless conflict. Let me share a story. A guy I know, let's call him Ben, was constantly getting into debates with a co-worker who loved to argue. It didn't matter what the topic was. This co-worker always had to be right. One day, during yet another pointless back and forth, Ben realized something. This guy wasn't looking for truth. He was looking for control. So Ben did something different. He stopped engaging. He simply said, "You might be right," and walked away. And guess what? His co-worker was left sitting there, speechless. No argument, no validation, no satisfaction, just the empty space where a fight was supposed to be. Ben had won, not by proving himself, but by refusing to play the game. So how do you know when to walk away? First, ask yourself, does this argument have a purpose? If the other person is unwilling to listen, there's no point in continuing. Second, look at their intentions. Are they seeking truth or just seeking control? And finally, remember, your peace is more valuable than their validation. You don't need to win every battle. Sometimes the real victory is choosing not to fight at all. At the end of the day, wise people don't argue for the sake of arguing. They know when to speak, when to listen, and when to walk away. So let them have the last word, because the strongest move you can make is knowing when to leave. If you found this valuable, hit like and subscribe for more powerful insights.